Good evening, visitors. Welcome to the Australian War Memorial's Last Post ceremony. My name is Dennis Stockman, and joining us today from the Royal Australian Navy is Warrant Officer Jason Russ. We warmly welcome the family of Private John William Parsons, whose story will be told shortly. We welcome the veterans who have served, those that are still serving, and the families that support them. We acknowledge the members of RSL and Services Clubs Association, RSL Victoria and RSL Queensland who are watching the broadcast of this ceremony across Australia. During the ceremony, wreaths will be laid at the base of the Pool of Reflection by family and visitors to the memorial. Please stand and join in singing the national anthem. The Australian War Memorial was the vision of Charles Bean, Australia's First World War official historian. Bean landed with the Australian troops on Gallipoli and stayed with them at the front through to the end of the war. The idea of this national memorial and museum came to him at Pozières, France, in the depths of the bloody fight in 1916. Bean's idea was that this would be a place where families and friends could mourn loved ones buried in faraway places. It would also be a place that could help all Australians understand what these men and women had endured and what they had done for us. Bean's vision, to which we remain true, is best expressed as inscribed in the entrance to the memorial's galleries. Here is their spirit, in the heart of the land they loved. And here we guard the record which they themselves made. Tonight, we'll read the story behind just one of those on the Roll of Honour, which lists the names of more than 102,000 men and women who have given their lives for us in war and operations for more than a century. But first we present a lament, Flowers of the Forest. Wreaths or floral tributes will now be laid at the Pool of Reflection.
Today we remember and pay tribute to Private John William Parsons. John Parsons was born on the 1st of November 1895 in Newcastle, New South Wales, to John and Sarah Parsons. He attended school in Newcastle and served in the cadets for 3 years. Following his education, he was employed as a grocery packer and joined the militia. He had been with the militia for 1.5 years when he enlisted in the Australian Imperial Forces in December 1917 at Victoria Barracks. He was taken on as a sapper and, after initial training, embarked from Sydney on the troop ship Runic on March 1918 with a group of engineer reinforcements. Arriving in France, he served with the 8th Field Company, Australian Engineers. Before being discharged at the end of the war, he was transferred to the veterinary hospital, where he worked before returning to Australia. Back in hometown of Newcastle, Parsons married Doris Shuck in 1922, and the couple went on to raise 2 daughters, Joanne and Mavis. With the coming of the Second World War in March 1941, Parsons again enlisted for service, giving his age as 40 in order to be accepted, though he was actually 45. Known by the nickname of Smiler, Parsons embarked from Sydney on the 17th of September, bound for Johor by way of Singapore. In Malaya, he joined the 2nd 3rd Motor Ambulance Convoy. On the 8th of December, the Japanese invaded Malaya and began their rapid advance towards Singapore. The unit was involved in transporting the wounded from field ambulances, carrying them over long, hazardous roads, contending with bombing and aerial machine gunning. Often, they would have to make a last-minute dash to get back from the front line by taking routes through rubber plantations, riverbeds and tracks. Following the surrender of Singapore on the 15th of February 1942, the 2nd 3rd Motor Ambulance Convoy carried the wounded and sick to Changi, concealing desperately needed medical stores, instruments and drugs in their ambulances. In February 1942, there were around 15,000 Australians in Changi, but for Parsons, it was just a transit stop. Working parties were being sent to other camps, and he was among the first Australians sent to Borneo as part of B Force, a group of nearly 1,500 who sailed from Singapore on the 8th of July 1942 in one of the so-called hell ships, the Ubi Maru. Prisoners were crammed into holds, forced to sit and sleep on small, crudely constructed wooden bunks. The atmosphere was stifling hot and putrid, and latrines were little more than wooden structures suspended over the edge of the ship. With many prisoners suffering from dysentery, conditions became foul. After arriving in Sandakan Harbour and then establishing camp, the prisoners were employed on building an airstrip. At first, conditions and food supplies were reasonable, but from September, control began to tighten. Prisoners were made to sign a promise not to escape, and senior officers were moved to Kuching in the Western Borneo. From mid-1943, conditions worsened further. A small cage was built within the camp to punish prisoners for trivial offences. Some men were confined without being able to stand up for as long as a month. An underground movement had grown among the civilians of Sandakan, but it was betrayed in July 1943. Reprisals were swift and brutal. 22 Australians, 5 Europeans, and around 50 locals were interrogated and tortured. The treatment of remaining prisoners deteriorated further in 1944 with brutal beatings, torture, and diminishing food supply. In January 1945, the Japanese began to fear an Allied invasion of Borneo and started to move prisoners away from the coast to Ranao, a small village some 255 kilometres inland in the mountains. The first group left in batches of 50, weak with beriberi and malnutrition, and most lacking boots. A second forced march was ordered in May when the Allies landed at Tarakan Island. The Japanese destroyed the camp at Sandakan, and the weakest of the prisoners were left behind without accommodation or medical care. William Parsons died, a prisoner of the Japanese, in Borneo on the 12th of July 1945. He was 49 years old. Today he is remembered on the Labuan Memorial in Malaysia. His name is listed on the Roll of Honour on my left, among more than 40,000 Australians who died while serving in the Second World War. His photograph is displayed today beside the Pool of Reflection. This is but one of many stories of service and sacrifice told here at the Australian War Memorial. We now remember Private John William Parsons, who gave his life for us, for our freedoms, and in the hope of a better world.
Please stand for the reading of the Ode and the sounding of the last post.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. They shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.
We will remember them.
Lest we forget.
Lest we forget. We leave you this evening with the words of the memorial's founder, Charles Bean. Many a man lying out there at Pozières or in the low scrub at Gallipoli with his poor tired senses barely working through the fever of his brain has thought in his last moments, well, it's over, but in Australia they'll be proud of this. Ladies and gentlemen, girls and boys, that concludes the last post ceremony. Thank you for visiting the Australian War Memorial, and good evening.